My pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker who will deliver the annual London lecture on Belarusian studies. I will introduce Professor Elena Korosteleva, and Professor Andrew Wilson will deal with the Q&A session because I need to get to London and prepare certain things for our evening reception. Elena Korosteleva is a professor of international politics and principal investigator for GCRF-funded project Compass at the University of Kent. She is director of the Global Europe Centre there and the co-convener of the Oxford Belarus Observatory. Her interests include resilience, complexity, order formation, and multi-order governance in wider Eurasia. Her recent publications are Resilience in EU and International Institutions and the Making of Resilient Communities in Central Eurasia. Elena, thank you very much for joining us. I know that you were planning to come in person, but there were, these storm-related developments were unexpected, so we still need to work in the hybrid mode. Thanks again for agreeing to join us, and we really look forward to your lecture, and it will also appear in print in the Journal of Belarusian Studies later this year. Elena, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this, Jarek, for this lovely introduction. And thank you for the invitation to speak at the 7th annual conference of Belarusian Studies. Indeed, I wish I could be there in person, like perhaps we all are. But then, alas, the pandemic and the political situation in Belarus and now even the weather have interfered with our plans, unfortunately. So before I proceed with my keynote, I should mention that the reception that follows for those who are in London and my today's lecture are supported by the GCRF that Jarek already referred to, by the Global Challenges Research Fund Compass project. And I'll just quickly post the links of all this for you to the chat. So this 4-year project, which I run together with my partners at Cambridge, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, conceptually looks at the challenges and our responses to those challenges through the lens of resilience, and urging us to rethink how we should be governed today as well. It is also a capacity building project structured along the 3 pillars, including research integration, policy impact, and community engagement. So we've managed to unearth a lot of interesting empirical data on which I'm relying in my presentation today, but also my work altogether. And it is thanks to this project that we produce over 400 outputs available on our website, and also launched a new initiative with the Oxford School of Global Area Studies, OSCA, called Oxford Belarus Observatory. Yet again, in the chat, it provided a link to that. Under the roof of OLBO, or Oxford Belarus Observatory, we run regular webinars every Thursday, focusing on topical issues related to Belarus in particular. So if you're interested, please do join us by registering there. There is another link in the chat there. So on this note, I will now proceed with my keynote lecture, and I also hope that you will enjoy the reception, for especially those who can attend in person. But unfortunately, not me today. So my lecture today will focus on, let me just close the chat so I can see you better. Okay, so my lecture today focuses on complexity, resilience, and the political in trying to understand the many crises in Belarus. And what I will do today, I will briefly outline the backdrop against which I'm building my argument, and I will then talk about complexity, resilience, and the political, to see how this might help us to understand the many crises in Belarus today. So the backdrop first. The events prior to, and especially after the 9th of August 2020 presidential election, have changed Belarus irreversibly. And here I'm not simply referring to the practice of rigged elections, which this time was so blatant that it turned even the most loyal electorate against the regime, thus triggering an institutional crisis, one of the very many that followed. I'm not even referring to the brutal response of the authorities to the protests that followed the election, which to date counts at the very least a dozen dead, over 1,000 political prisoners, 45,000 incarcerated, and millions beaten up, tortured, traumatized, robbed of their dignity, forced to live in fear or leave the country altogether. This is another crisis, a humanitarian crisis. I'm not even referring to state terrorism unleashed by the regime, which began with hijacking of the Ryanair plane and continued with a staged migrant crisis on the border with Poland and Lithuania, the bullying of Ukraine, as we see it today, and the threats to European and world security through a display of the so-called military might and claims just yesterday for super nuclear weaponry by Lukashenko, which is an international crisis now. And I'm not referring here even to the aftermath of sanctions introduced by the West in response to the violation of international norms and human rights in Belarus, and also Belarus' non-response to the pandemic, which left the country scarred and ruined, with the effect possibly comparable to the aftermath of the World War II, which is an economic and social contract crisis. What I am referring here to is an all-encompassing societal crisis of what has emerged with and after of all these unprecedented crises, which led to the rise of Belarusian peoplehood, or using perhaps the analogy with Arab Spring or the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, the groundswell of human indignation, or perhaps we could call it a revolution of indignation in Belarus, which is far more powerful and potent as it is also political. Not only it has made change irreversible, it also the immense resilience, it also basically exposed the immense resilience of the Belarusians themselves, not just in terms of their survivability, but also the ability to transform and be creative and be impactful, which also opened the way to the political as a space for new ideas, visions, beliefs, and relations, instilling a new sense of Belarusianness to every corner of Belarus and the world, and making the current processes irrevocable, demanding a rethink of who we are and how we should be governed today. You can see parallels with my project here. So what I will focus today is on trying to understand, perhaps reframe and re-relate the processes that we've seen in the country. We've seen those processes perhaps with awe and horror, compassion and hatred, using complexity, resilience, and the political as the conceptual reference here. So complexity. To date, we tend to understand all these crises in Belarus, or perhaps in other countries, through the prisms of various mainstream theories. For example, democratization, nation or identity building, and so on. We put this very much, we often refer to the context of the 1989, for example, democratization in Central and Eastern Europe, and compared with similar societal mobilization, or what is now known as colored revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and other countries in post-Soviet space. We also often use references to Huntington, Carruthers, and so on, and use also, I would say, positivist scholars of democratic theories and transition paradigms to explain change, pegging our explanations to fixed occurrences in time and geography and cultural space. But to note, these occurrences are also living experiences. They're not objects and they're not subjects. and they perhaps don't even have background. They emerge, they work through, and then they dissipate. So what we see here, and what we need to understand, that we see very much relations that generate this change, and therefore it is fairly futile to look back in search of a potential status quo. What we need to do is to look forward in terms of what these relations, this mesh of relations and entanglement have produced and will produce in the future. So all these theories clearly have their explanatory value. I don't deny that, absolutely. But as such, they seem to explain only an aspect of something much, much bigger that we feel, but we can't grasp or capture it yet. That we see change, but the change is still very much intangible. So something more powerful and importantly still ongoing, something that constantly evolves, re-relates, stretches out and changes everything, which we still have a limited knowledge and understanding of even today. So therefore I will call it, in terms of trying to understand and explain and embrace this change, I will call on complexity, with reference to perhaps the work of Milian Kowalski and others. For example, the theory of relationality introduced by Emilia Kirke, a theory of mesh and entanglements introduced by Morton, for example. So the point here is that all the above theories and approaches, they fail to account to a degree for informal, hidden and unstable processes unfolding in society through intra and inter relations, leading to change that breaks through the politics of fixed institutional arrangements and practices. They often overlook non-organized forms of communal activities, which is at the heart of any change, and tend to focus on fixed structures and institutions. There is no end to these developments, and there is no background either. These relations emerge, grow, percolate into communities, acquire some state political forms and means to protect themselves, and then they may dissipate. But more importantly, as I've already mentioned, they are all living organisms, and they serve in their purpose to evolve into a new form of life and new form of arrangement. So this life is often referred in the works that were already mentioned as VUCA world, a world of vulnerability, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. And we need to acknowledge that this VUCA life or VUCA world we live in, we're not in control of it due to our limited knowledge and our knowability of the future, or what these emergent relations can and will bring to us in search for a better life. So this is what we call very much in the work that we produced, complexity thinking, that precisely would allow us to see this invisible, intangible signs of change more clearly, as non-linear, as emergent, as self-organizing without any central control, as relational and processual in the workings of societal entanglements. So complexity does not directly hit institutions and structures, as I mentioned, exterior forces or power resources for that matter. Rather, it sees a society as a complex, open and living organism where everything is interconnected, where everything is non-linear, constantly in flux and therefore unpredictable, where due to this non-linearity, a minute or seemingly localized change can have tremendous effects on the stability of the whole, and where this whole, in response to crisis or adversity, has the ability to correct itself by transforming into a more sustainable entity, despite all the odds. So this whole is not the state or regime or one's authority. This whole is a community of relations or human community, as a constellation of persons or groups in the definition of Hedley-Bull, where through this contestation of conflict as part of the political, a new ordering takes place, a new ordering that would require in turn new institutions to support the new way of thinking. And it is constituted bottom up and around, in the words of Emilian Kowalski, in the pursuit of set goals. So this is what complexity is. And you wonder perhaps why I'm referring to it when I actually talk about Belarus. So where do we go from here? And that's where resilience as a second conceptual referent comes in. If we agree that it is not the institutions, external or domestic forces that make this change possible, these tangible or intangible signs of change, then we need to look for explanations on the ground through a granular view of the processes and relations that so powerfully emerged and self-organized, perhaps in the first instance in response to COVID, supporting the vulnerable, and later in response to brutality and unjustified violence unleashed by the regime. So here then we would argue that if we see society very much as an open system, as some form of a mesh or entanglement of relations, a Pandora box full of these relations, it is then characterized by radically different features and mechanisms. So what we see is, in the first instance, that it is an open system with hidden and opaque relations, but it also allows us to see people not as masses on the background of political processes or a particular factor affecting the development of political regimes, but primarily as core actors involved in and shaping the myriad of these relations, interconnected with each other and defined by and defining themselves, the relations themselves and the relations around them. So given that the inherent feature of an open system is the ability to self-organize itself in response to adversity or to challenge, then human community of relations can be seen as the primary source of systems resilience. So here, that's where resilience actually comes in as a concept. And the way I define resilience here is precisely self-governance, how people as communities come to form themselves, organize themselves, drawing on their inherent strengths, on their desire for a sense of good life, a vision of good life, which is very much a rational vision, perhaps in the process of very much irrational fighting. And so resilience as self-governance is very much an open system driven from bottom up and around in the search for good life, aspirations, and using communal resources and infrastructures, and also being driven and glued by emotions, the so-called opaque world of community of relations. So this then, if we talk about resilience as self-organizing system of community, it takes us further and opens the door to understand change as moving from politics to the political, as an open space for power contestation, or if I were to define it in words of Jenny Atkins, as a process of struggle and mutations of one social order into the next one. So when suddenly this groundswell emerges bottom up, what we see is that the old order has passed the point of no return, and then a new social order is emerging, and emerging through struggle of ideas, and including, of course, political struggle, and that what is called the political rather than politics. It is an open space where ideas are contested, and where one's authority is eventually legitimized, thus leading as the next point of development to the fixing of specific institutions and evolving therefore into politics with relevant power authority and with relevant institutions to support this authority. So more importantly then, the political draws on the collective aspirations for the future and the shared sense of the good life when opening more space for debate. So now, having outlined this complexity, resilience, and the political, how do we understand the many crises in Belarus? Let's try to explore it on what we see in Belarus today, or at least for the past nearly 2 years, what is happening in the country. So from complexity perspective, what we observe in Belarus is a groundswell of popular mobilization and the emergence of new pathways in a mesh of relations in response to a crisis of past-dependent power relations, perceived by the people dissatisfied with the oppressive nature of the regime. It is very much the crisis of the local, because in complexity thinking, all fundamental sources, forces and structures, they arise from local processes and not by means of action at a distance. The local in this context is not a geographical term, but actually positionality in the mesh of relations, meaning being situated close to a political challenge, being within the community we very much focus on at the moment. So what we observe is that the local self-organization manifested in a composite of the acquired intergenerational knowledge and also the social-cultural imageries of the future that help people to make sense of what the world in the quest for self-conception and to distinguish the right from the wrong in the process of their self-creation. Very much when we look at Belarus and what has occurred there is that kind of exposure of and cross-fertilization of knowledge, expectations and conceptions of the good life. Suddenly that sense of good life that glued people together into this new form of community came to light and became quite tangible in many different ways. So what we saw is that, of course, this discontent we saw in the past, for example, in the form of the jeans revolution back in 2006, or the 2010 October Square 10 revolution. They all could be understood perhaps as the kind of previous attempts of the system to establish these new pathways of relations, altering power relations in the system. But they somehow at that time and that kind of cultural but also social space that really didn't reach that kind of cumulative moment where these relations and their entanglements suddenly acquire this new drive and new purpose. What we saw in 2020 was another kind of attempt to redesign the system in response to the kind of undercurrent visions for the future. And this time, somehow, it became very much real. And I think, of course, there are many factors, different factors that came to contribute to this, including, of course, broken social contract that has been in place for a number of years. But also, interestingly, the pandemic itself, as I've already mentioned, which actually forced people to, given the non-state response to pandemic, it actually forced people to self-organize themselves in their localities, be it dvary, be it supolnes, be it something else, in order to help the most vulnerable. And this somehow, these forms, intangible forms of community relations, they allowed them to become tangible and spill out into the open in a self-organizing way when suddenly this challenge of oppression emerged later on with post-2020 election. So these dynamics ensued in this irrevocable breakdown of public trust, seeing even the most loyal Lukashenko electorate, pensioners whom he hand-fed for years with last-minute handouts on the eve of every election, and the workforce tamed through excessive drinking and steady, but really very meager pay, turning against him. And it seems that the only way to maintain a semblance of control by the government today is actually to continue practices exclusive violence and oppression, leaving no room for dissent or even a whiff of counter action, threatening the world with super nukes and possible sabotage of the nuclear power station on the border with Lithuania. In today's Belarus, no one is safe. Wrong-colored socks or hair or Facebook dislikes can give a direct ticket to prison for many, let alone for public criticism or open action these days. So what about people? If I keep saying that people, not the system, not the institutions, but the people are at the heart of this, what I keep claiming, a reversible change. If we look at, yet again, if we use the traditional theories to explain what is happening in Belarus today, then in light of today's situation, nearly 2 years after the 2020 elections, we could perhaps conclude that it is another case of failed or stalled revolution, because we no longer see those protests on the street. People fear to come out in groups wearing the wrong color, take it to the streets. They fear even to perhaps legitimately attend the forthcoming referendum and so on. So in Belarus, even through the 2021 protests in Belarus have been unprecedented in their volumes, but they now all been seemingly tamed by the regime, with many activists and civic organizations labeled it as extremist, being imprisoned and forced out of the country. But from a complexity perspective, we actually see a slightly different picture. We can claim here that what we observe in Belarus today is the formation and the rise of Belarusian peoplehood, facilitated in response to the power crisis and the violent crackdown by the regime. From a complexity perspective, it originally emerged through a relational mesh, as I mentioned already, and support infrastructures to combat COVID, bottom up, in the absence of the state response. But this then turned into a political force, which did not just bring people together in their processes of fighting injustice and violence. It was about conveying senses of meaning and value, defining political goals and sustaining support for the political community in difficult times. These being together and not merely in similar ways has served as a catalyst and amplifier for hidden processes of change, making them inevitable and irreversible that way, and leading to full-blown self-organized public mobilization. What we saw earlier on, these multi-thousand crowds regularly emerging here and there across the entire country, being guided by raw emotions and the pain of indignations, without any pronounced leadership. They were marching in demand for justice and for rationally envisaged collective tomorrow, a country for living, if you recall Tikhanovsky's campaign, and not for leading it. This was not an organized civic movement or a political grouping of any shape or form. This was the proper rise of peoplehood, people from all walks of life, nationality, profession, age, and orientation, molded by an act of civic activism and triggered by COVID-19 pandemic, when the government refused to help. Through opacity and hidden relational dynamics, what has emerged is an incredibly powerful moment of becoming with, a peoplehood. And this has grown out of multiple networks, be it real networks of dvary, of supolnes, or digital networks, but also being united by a collective sense of belonging to Teisha, for example, and most of all by civic activism developing to Hramata, all of them born out in support of the vulnerable and the oppressed, and make change. Precisely this make change perhaps yet invisible now that it is all going underground, and yet change is very much afoot. And that's what leads us to see it slightly differently, not as a failed or stalled revolution. We see it actually very much as a process, or many entangled processes that are going ahead. So what is the political and what is yet to come? From a complexity perspective, change, while invisible, it is nevertheless irreversible. It has challenged the power of the incumbent through a relational measure of the human community, who disagreed and disputed the actions of Lukashenko, and making really his claims to power rather untenable, and his institutional enforcement and proposals for constitutional change irrelevant. So through multiple feedback loops and the rise of peoplehood and the emergence of strong people networks of support inside the country, but also external leverage through sanctions and media and the processes which are now unfolding internally, have opened up a Pandora box of the political, a fiercely contested space of ideas and visions for the future as to what kind of new social domain should emerge in the process of transformation. And that's what we see it as very much the space which is currently contested, and the space that actually past the point of no return of Lukashenko's politics, no matter what narratives and other means he currently deploys. So at this moment of time, the future of Belarus and Belarus social domain, while clearly altering, is still very much unpredictable and uncontrollable in many different ways. At the same time, given a societal response to Lukashenko's oppressive actions, deep and extensive social learning is clearly afoot. What is certain, given the scale and the depths of indignation experienced in Belarus, the ongoing political, humanitarian, and other types of crises have laid robust normative foundations for change, for what the future politics will be, thus with time closing the political space for a renewed, open, complex system of human relations to take hold. So in conclusions, what I would like to say is that we here ambitiously introduced a new agenda for understanding the many crises in Belarus, through the lens of complexity and resilience. But we also argue that this new conceptualization through this lens of complexity and resilience allow us also to see what we haven't really seen before in terms of hidden, undervalued, and not so much undervalued. It allows us to capture hidden, emergent, informal, and relational processes within the society, which to date have been somewhat undervalued in our analysis in trying to find suitable explanations for what is going on there. And this actually define what we see in Belarus today, not as a hopeless or, I don't know, a case of failed revolution, but rather as a body, as a social domain where we see change ongoing, where we see change and kind of the new shape of a society as irreversible. And that's despite the alleged failure of the 2021 protests. So what the future will hold for Belarus is still unclear. However, the fact that the human community and the peoplehood are now the drivers of this change, as I've been emphasizing today, is very reassuring, and perhaps the only certainty that complex thinking could warrant today. And I would like to finish with the words of Janka Kupala that I use actually a lot in my writing these days. So, «Подимайся з низин, це каліна сім'я, над крижами батьков, над нягодами Занимай, Беларусь, молодая моя, свой почестный посад между народами. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Could you kindly translate those words for the non-Belarusian speakers?
Right. Wait, I've just shut my presentation. Wait 2 seconds if I reopen it. Of course, this will not sound as poetically as Janka Kupala put it. Just give me a second. I'll just find my presentation. Okay. Okay, so going to the very end. So these words, rise from below, the eagle family, fly over the crosses of the deceased and the sorrow. Take your place, young Belarus, your honored place between the peoples of the world. Hope it makes sense.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elena. Sorry to have to ask. Right, we have 20 minutes for questions. I see some hands have gone up already. Either raise a virtual hand or type in the chat. I didn't quite see the order they went up in, but I think Vera, you were first, then Paul, then Sophie.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena. It was really great presentation and wonderful poetry, really close to my heart. I just want to understand, because I am a very a loyal listener to this lectures on Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's office and Oxford Observatory. I just want to understand, are there any reason why those lectures are not going online with a translation, so that Belarusian people from Belarus can actually listen to them? Because right now they're only coming in English, and if there is a technical problem, I'm happy to help you to put it technically together in Belarusian language. That's basically my question, because that would be in line with what you are saying, that how society is developing and how we can help Belarusian society. And I can see that if we will not translate anything what we are saying about Belarusian society in a language that they could understand, they will feel very lonely, isolated, as people talking about them, and they are not involved. Thank you.
Absolutely, Vera, thank you very much. And I'm actually surprised to hear this question, because if anything, well, first of all, just for clarity purposes, we're talking about our joint initiative between Oxford Belarus Observatory, Research Center of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and Compass Project, the series of webinars that we run every Thursday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon UK time. We run these webinars with the option, interpretation option, on 3 languages. It's in English, Russian, and Belarusian. And therefore, the recording, although the recording I think is offered in English, but potentially if requested, the recording could also be done in Belarusian language or Russian language. So it is all available for use, and everyone could join us, because it is an open public initiative. So Vera, but thank you very much. I'll raise it with the co-organizers, technical organizers of this, to see if perhaps a Belarusian version could be recorded as well. But in addition to that, we are planning also a number of community engagement event, unfortunately at this time still virtual, but I do hope that the time will come that they will become more physical and tangible that way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, when you listen to the seminar, yes, you can hear Belarusian and you can hear English. but the recording that comes out are only in English, and people are curious if we are hiding something from them. That's all. Thank you.
No. I'll request perhaps if there is a technical possibility of recording in Russian or Belarusian, then we'll see if this is possible at all. Thank you.
Thanks. Question was from Paul Hansbury.
So thank you, Elena. This is quite an argument that has quite a lot of components to it, so I hope I followed it correctly. You said that these crises had led to this cumulative moment. These entanglements of these crises in 2020 led to this cumulative moment, and this had unleashed sort of a new purpose which should become ineluctable, and this was what set it apart from a lot of other perspectives which would see a sort of failed revolution. And this ineluctability is leading to some new community or sense of the good life for Belarusians, based on picking up on the complexity and the resilience. But at the same time, what I was hearing, this is contested and it's unclear where this is going. So I suppose my question is that if you can't give, or I mean, can you give a sort of some sense of the picture of what this new community good life might look like? And if not, what's the utility of your sort of argument or theoretical complex as opposed to some of these other body of theory that is already out there? Yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. Actually, a very good question. And that's one of the reasons why I'm using complexity, because if we look at the world around us, the world we live in today, that actually, it is very difficult to view it in positivist terms, in a sense of, linear development. So whatever input we let's say we give into the system, then we expect a certain output, and that of course is has never been the case and will not be the case. What I'm saying is that if we see world for what it is, in all its complexity and entanglement and interrelations, then it is actually very difficult. It is very difficult to claim any knowledge about this world, which means that we need to accept our own limited knowability, but also our limited control over what is going on. Why I'm using that? I think this complex world, especially I think the pandemic exposed to the limitations of what we can do. We can perhaps, with certain vaccines, we can control the situation locally, and that's why the perspective of the local is very, very important. But yet we still can't anticipate or foresee what is going to happen tomorrow, and that changes our perspective as to how we live and should be governed today. So what we saw in Belarus, and what could not be explained by all these traditional theories, they could explain some aspects of the developments in Belarus, but they cannot capture its complexity. Is the fact that we always look. Let's say, if we were to introduce specific institutions, we expect, specific results. Let's say, if we run elections, then of course we should anticipate a form of democratic policy, politics emerging, or at least some form of mentality in that particular case. That is not the case, because it's not the institutions that lead, certain developments. It is actually the ideas, it is actually relations that emerge between the people, and democracy that way as a form of governance is less about, specific arrangements. It's more about people coming together and forming those kind of communities that are shaped by their sense of good life. And that's where a sense of good life is very important, because it glues us together. It could be many different senses of good life. But at the same time, what has emerged in Belarus and became quite bare and open, exposed, is the fact that people simply want to be treated as people, as humans. And this kind of, for what they are, for their dignity. And the fact that, the regime so brutally violated that dignity, it really resonated across the society. And that's why it all brought people together in a sense of finding that kind of new way to build new society, new community, with the vision of clear vision of what is right. And the right is not to be treated as bydla or as drug addicts or prostitutes and this and that. It's to be treated as people who contribute to the system and want some form of return from the system to benefit all, not just a few. I don't know if I answered your question, but so basically the emphasis is shifting on the relations between people and how these relations, through their shared sense of good life, new shared sense of identity, how actually it can push people to work together, to instill some form of change. But yeah. What I'm saying is also that there is no way back. The previous status quo in a complex system is irrelevant. And therefore the system has to rebalance itself to find new status quo. And what it will be is going to be interesting to see.
There might be some epistemological questions coming up on that, but I mean, the sort of inherent dignity is a powerful idea. So thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks. As we're approaching 10 to 6, I'll take 3 questions together. First, Sophie, then Nikolai, and if Batleshchik could then read out their question from the chat. So first, Sophie.
Thank you. And I hope you hear me. My internet is going on and off. So yeah, good. Thank you very much. And I'm really excited to hear this. I think the idea that this was not a failed revolution, but rather something happened in society, that this politicization actually means something. I really like the idea of the resilient society. My question is, I'm wondering, how can we then establish the link between this resilient society and some political change? So I wonder, how can people actually become the drivers of change? Because the whole problem before was that the politics was set aside. The politics was something that the government was dealing with, that the opposition was involved with, but people were never there. But now they became involved, but Lukashenko is closing all the doors. And the election was the way for people to become involved. But what other options are there? Can we actually kind of foresee that there is some sort of way for people to be the drivers of change besides on kind of an intellectual level? Thank you.
We'll collect the 3 questions. So Nikolai, you're next.
Thank you. Professor Korosteleva would be aware of a certain debate about 8 years ago at a fora such as Crises on whether East European populations preferred freedom from choice or freedom of choice. Now, looking back, what happened in Ukraine and in Belarus, within the theoretical paradigm that you've described, what can you summarize what, in your opinion, are the main factors of switching from a preference from a freedom from choice to a desire to a freedom of choice, and for that choice or switch being sustainable? Thank you.
Thank you. And Batleshchik, would you like to read out your question?
Sure, thank you. Do you think, Elena, some of the developments in the last 2 years are not sort of new, but rather resumption of the old fights, in the mid-1990s, all the sort of debates about history and white flag? It's almost sort of, you're now reading something in the newspapers from that time, as if you had like some sort of zastoy, for 20 years, and suddenly people decided to refight the long forgotten fight.
Thanks. Elena?
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, for those who are interested, obviously I heavily have drawn on theory because I wanted to introduce kind of a slightly shift our focus from all this kind of positivist thinking, always anticipating something tangible in return. So for those who are interested, I published a number of articles, including the Journal of Common Market Studies on Belarus annual review. So please do read that. But going to Sophie's question. How to kind of connect, see that kind of connection between resilient society and a form of political change. You see that's we already see change, but in terms of, you know, shifting from one, what we see today, we're at the stage, as I keep mentioning, of the political. So we're in the stage of that open space where we see that people are not just forming their opinion about what is right and wrong, but people are also forming their new identity in terms of what they want to see from the future. And that future is important for them because now they see that where they don't want to be, and where they want, you know, in terms of looking forward. And as we know, Felix Berenskot actually used a very interesting, he developed a very interesting framework. The only rational thinking that we have is actually our thinking about the future, because it's our dreams that we want to reach. But how we get there is altogether a different matter. But what is important, we may not see that conversion of those hidden relations today into something tangible and political, you know, like proper political force that would form, you know, a new form of society. Perhaps today we will not see it. But what is important to acknowledge is that the processes, like, you know, in a complex system, like, you know, the chain reaction, it has already started, and therefore it cannot go back. It can only move forward in that kind of, in the direction what people define for themselves as that better future, that sense of good life. So that's why I stay very positive about the future, because, you know, it will take perhaps a while, you know, to change the status, well, what is, you know, the institutional arrangements of the past, but it will come. And there is no direct correlation between that kind of social force already unleashed. Look at the Arab Spring, you know, absolute turmoil, but people will never go back to those authoritarian fixtures that they had in the past, and they will search for better arrangements that could actually help them to, with time, to realize their visions that they haven't developed precisely through this process of change. So I'm sorry, I cannot give you time or kind of a more reassuring answer. The only answer is that it is all processual, and we are getting there with change. The second question, so freedom of and freedom from, to make choice more sustainable. When we talk about resilient societies, and Belarus is clearly one of them, just like Ukraine or perhaps any other society, when what we see is a sense of emerging identity and a very tangible sense of good life that glues all of us together in that fight for better future. It is already becoming a choice of itself. It's a choice that is produced by community, but communities, the community that is not an ephemeral, you know, construction. It is a community that actually chose to chose to challenge what it does not see fit for purpose any longer. And it's the community that chose to move along with change, not simply to adapt again to survive. No, it's the community that chose to challenge, and the community that learning through this process of open challenge, be it either in prison or be it through beatings up, torture, all sorts of violations of human dignity. But it's that choice that has become conscious choice. It's a choice of, and it is already sustainable that way. So I think what Belarusians are experiencing today, it's that point, tipping point that we didn't see back in 2010. We didn't see back in 2006, but we see it today simply because those relations, they've come out onto the open, and people see that they're not individuals, or they're not kind of singular entities. They are en masse. And this en masse will take us into the much brighter future, believe me. What was the third question? I'm sorry.
The third question was whether some of the current developments actually not new, but sort of forgotten fights, from the mid-90s. Because some of the ideological debates, on the papers sort of have a sense of déjà vu.
Yes, thank you. But what I was going to say, that there is nothing sudden about today's developments in Belarus, or be it Ukraine or somewhere else. It is just that kind of cumulative process that suddenly takes a new qualitative life. So therefore, we are connected with the past that way. There is our present is a constant process, and what we have as a rational tomorrow is basically our, I would say, our self-made ticket to happier future. So we are very much connected in that way, through our because intergenerational knowledge. There is a fantastic scholar, Sadiki, who wrote about this kind of democratic loop. So what happens is that through all these processes of trying to make our life better, trying and failing, and yet we are learning through generations. We are kind of acquiring that knowledge of what can work and what failed in the past. So eventually there comes a point, as I keep saying, a point of no return, or a tipping point that takes us suddenly into something else, because no one expected to see that kind of result after the elections. We saw the same numbers back in the previous years, previous elections, but never before we saw that response, that impressive, hair-raising response that every single one, almost citizen of Belarus, they felt that it was their duty to take to the streets, to protest against what they saw as, as the violation of their, of their humanity. And that's what I think makes, this was the connection with the past, that how long can we actually, bear this abuse, this, constant threats of everything. How long can we live in fear? No more, people said. And that's what makes this connection with the past as a cumulative and now into a qualitatively different future, which obviously we see today that the present is not particularly, it's still through suffering, but the process going on. And these little steps through, for example, freeing I forgot her first name, Hersh today, the fact that, that she managed to hold on to that sense of what the future should be, despite everything. And so many other people who, who experience Maria Kolesnikova, for example, it helps us to go on and helps us to, bring that, make that tomorrow more tangible. I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope there is something there for you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you for your talk and excellent answers to questions. Hope everybody enjoyed the whole day's conference. We still have a reception at 7. Thank you again to Elena and the Compass Project for sponsoring that. Sponsored receptions.
You're welcome.
Sorry, I'm at the other end of England.
Me too.
But I'll see you soon.
Indeed, yes, and thank you very much once again for the invitation and for your insightful comments. And I look forward to a better tomorrow. And enjoy the reception for those who can attend it.
Okay, I'll formally end this session now. But those who are off to the reception, do enjoy it and do enjoy the day tomorrow. Thank you all.